On the morning of the St. Cuthbert's Flower and Produce show, the air of Flaxborough was rich with the odour of boiled sugar, polish, and anticipation. A faint drizzle lent the bunting the subdued dignity of damp respectability, while the marquee on the vicarage lawn billowed like a self-conscious debutante in too much satin. Mrs. Emmeline Bligh, whose philanthropy was as well advertised as it was resented, presided near the jam display with a clipboard and a look suggesting that God himself might profit from her advice. "Not quite set, Mrs. Moffat," she observed, prodding a trembling specimen of raspberry preserve with a spoon. "I dare say it will pass, but only if we are feeling merciful, Mrs. Moffat," whose son-in-law painted the signboard outside the parish hall, replied with a smile of such radiant insincerity that a weaker woman might have swooned. By 2 o'clock the judging was in progress. The brass band had resumed its cautious rendering of Jerusalem, and only the most hardened competitors still rearranged their chrysanthemums in hope of divine intervention. It was at that exact moment that the widow's bell, silent for nearly 50 years, began to toll. The sound was thin yet clear, descending from the old stone tower of St. Cuthbert's like a reproach from heaven. For a few seconds the crowd froze, then faces turned upwards, first in confusion, then in something approaching fear. Someone muttered, "It's the widow's bell," and the words spread like an infection. The bell had last been rung. It was said when the young curate's wife drowned herself in the mill pond. Before that, when old Mr. Pottle had choked on his goose at Christmas dinner. Tradition held that it tolled on its own to foretell the death of one who had wronged a widow, an unusually flexible qualification in a town like Flaxborough. The vicar, Reverend Sims, came bustling through the crowd, his face the colour of undercooked sweet. "No one's in the tower," he declared, with the conviction of one who dearly hopes it to be true. Mrs. Bligh, perhaps finding the supernatural intrusion unhelpful to her schedule, began to chide a bystander for hysteria. "It is doubtless the wind," she announced, "or a loose mechanism." These things... Her sentence ended abruptly, not from lack of words, but of breath. She clutched her chest, gave a small, surprised "oh," and collapsed among the dahlias. The crowd, whose sympathy was tempered by curiosity, gathered in a deferential semicircle. The vicar bent over her with the air of a man, attempting prayer but expecting paperwork. "She's fainted," someone said, hopefully, but it was a faint with a finality that even the most optimistic observer could not mistake. A minute later, Constable Love, his helmet slightly askew from running, arrived to establish official presence. He took one look, pursed his lips, and said, "That'll be trouble." Sir, he was not wrong. From the church tower, the bell gave one last, lingering toll, as though to confirm the town's worst suspicions, before lapsing again into the pious silence of history. By the time Inspector Purbright arrived from the station, the marquee had become a gossip exchange of such vitality that one might have thought the entire event arranged for its benefit. He regarded the scene with his customary mildness, his eyes moving from the corpse to the tower and then thoughtfully to the faces around him. "Curious thing," said the vicar, wringing his hands. "No one could have rung it." "The tower door was locked," Purbright nodded. "Locks," he said, "are excellent devices, when they keep out the right people." The vicar looked puzzled. Purbright, however, was not addressing him, but the general air of Flaxborough itself, a town that had never required the supernatural to produce mischief, though it occasionally found the idea convenient. As the ambulance arrived and Mrs. Bligh's body was carried past the exhibits, someone whispered, "The widow's bell has claimed another." Purbright watched them go, hands folded behind his back, and murmured to no one in particular. "Then perhaps it will be kind enough to explain how." By the following morning, the rain had washed the bunting into limp submission, and the marquee at St. Cuthbert's resembled the remains of an ill-advised picnic. Yet, the event was far from over. In Flaxborough, no tragedy concluded until it had been properly aired, dissected, and embroidered in the town's tea-rooms. At the Copper Kettle, the first pot of the day had barely steeped before the matter of Mrs. Bligh's death began to simmer with it. Mrs. Moffat, now liberated from competition and propriety, leaned across her saucer with relish. Dropped dead, she did, right there between the dahlias. Reverend Sims was babbling about the bell, but I dare say it was gilt. She'd been skimming the Restoration Fund, that one. Miss Peacock, who ran the haberdashery and considered gossip a civic duty, sniffed. Nonsense. Heart trouble, most likely. Though it is strange about the bell. My cousin heard it rang by itself the year her cat died. From the next table came a low chuckle. Mr. Cribbins, the church treasurer, seldom wasted words, but when he did speak, they left dents. The bell's no ghost, ladies. It's a rope and a lump of metal. If it told, someone pulled it. Mrs. Moffat eyed him sharply. And you'd know about that, wouldn't you, being the man with keys to the tower? The remark produced a flutter of satisfaction all round, quickly disguised as sympathy. Across town, at the Cosy Nook Cafe, similar debates raged between buttered scones. Here the emphasis fell less on theology and more on arithmetic. They say she'd lent the church money, observed Mr. Penrith, the undertaker, but no one's ever seen the paperwork. Now she's gone, who's to ask? His companion, Mrs. Dapple, sipped her tea with the air of a woman rehearsing modesty. There was talk, she murmured, that the widow's fund was never fully accounted for. And now this curse, I call that convenient. By noon the bell's toll had acquired a narrative life of its own. It had rung twice, then thrice, then in a mournful peal, audible as far as the railway bridge. The corpse had been transported to the infirmary, but the story of her departure multiplied with each retelling. Inspector Purbright, meanwhile, sat in his office listening to Constable Love's enthusiastic report. The young constable had visited both tea-rooms and returned armed with hearsay of industrial proportions. Seems everyone thinks the bell's haunted. "Sir," Love announced, notebook trembling with excitement. "And they're saying Mrs. Bligh misused church money." "Could be motive there, don't you think?" Purbright considered this with mild interest. Motive, yes, but for what? Theft? Revenge? Or merely conversation? Love frowned, uncertain. Still, it's suspicious she died just then. Right when the bell rang. "Indeed," said Purbright, "though coincidence, in my experience, is a more punctual fellow than most murderers." He rose and went to the window, watching the grey drizzle form patterns on the glass. "Tell me, Love, who besides Mrs. Bligh had access to the church tower?" "Vicar Sims, Mr. Cribbins, and the bell-ringer lad, sir." "Harold Peggins? Ah, yes," Purbright murmured. "The same lad who believes angels oil the bell when no one's looking." Love shifted, unsure if amusement was permitted. "Should I bring him in?" "Not yet," said Purbright. "Let the town talk a little longer. They may think faster when they're not being asked questions." By late afternoon, the rumour had reached its full maturity. The widow's bell had not only tolled for Mrs. Bligh, but was said to have cracked a pane in the vestry window and frightened the church cat into celibacy. Theories expanded. Facts contracted. The tea-urns boiled on. Reverend Sims poured tea with the caution of a man handling evidence. His hands trembled slightly, though whether from grief or guilt was hard to tell. "A most dreadful occurrence, Inspector," he murmured, lowering himself into an armchair whose floral upholstery seemed to disapprove of him. Mrs. Bligh was, well, she was the church in many ways. Purbright, seated opposite with polite stillness, inclined his head. "Indeed, I understand she was also its principal benefactor." "Quite so. Generous beyond measure." The vicar dabbed his forehead. "Her passing leaves a gap, both spiritual and, fiscal." Purbright allowed the faintest smile. "The two are often closely related." A silence followed, filled only by the sound of the clock ticking reproachfully above the mantel. Then the inspector asked, "Would you describe your relationship with Mrs. Bligh as cordial?" Sims hesitated. "Well, cordial, yes. Though she was, how shall I say, firm in her convictions. She believed good work should be accompanied by proper recognition, such as plaques, announcements, and named pews. Precisely, Purbright sipped his tea. And the Restoration Fund? I gather she contributed a considerable sum. Yes, though there were others. Mr. Cribbins managed the accounts. A most reliable man. The vicar's tone contained the nervous eagerness of one passing responsibility along a conveyor belt. If there were any irregularities, they would certainly not have been of my making. I see, Purbright murmured. And the bell, this widow's bell, when was it last rung intentionally? Sims blinked. Oh, not in my time. We considered it unlucky. Mrs. Bligh insisted it remain silent, actually. Said it was a relic of heathen superstition. Ironic, now that I think of it. The inspector stood and glanced about the vicar's study. Neatly stacked ledgers, a dusty photograph of the church choir, a faint scent of candle wax and compromise. Might I see the parish accounts, Mr. Cribbins's work? Of course. They're kept in the vestry safe. The safe, when opened, revealed tidy orderliness marred only by one envelope that did not belong. Purbright lifted it delicately. The handwriting on its front, Widow's Legacy Appeal, was elegant but faintly disguised, the loops of the letters more deliberate than natural. Inside were 2 receipts, both bearing Mrs. Bligh's signature and dated within a fortnight of her death. The sums did not match the entries in the church ledger. Purbright made no remark, only folded the papers again and slipped them back. Curious, he said softly. We do rather rely on miracles of accounting in such matters. As he left the vicarage, the drizzle had ceased, and a watery sun attempted a reluctant appearance over the churchyard. The bell tower loomed above, its louvres black against the pale sky. From below it appeared both innocent and watchful. Constable Love awaited him near the gate, his notebook ready. Anything, sir? Only confirmation that faith and finance share a pew, Purbright replied, and perhaps that generosity, when excessive, invites arithmetic to misbehave. Love frowned. Meaning, sir? Meaning, Purbright said, looking back at the tower, that Mrs. Bligh's good works may have been measured in something other than pounds and pence, and someone's conscience may not have kept perfect balance. As they walked toward the station, the sound of distant gossip drifted from the market square, talk of funerals, curses, and bells that rang themselves. Purbright listened absently, his thoughts arranging themselves with the quiet precision of a man setting chess pieces before the first move. By the following morning, Constable Love had acquired both enthusiasm and evidence, 2 things not always compatible in his line of work. He entered Purbright's office carrying a brown envelope and the air of a man who had solved something. Got the print, sir? He announced. On the bell rope. Clear as you like. Belonged to Harold Peggins, the assistant verger. Purbright regarded him mildly. As might reasonably be expected of the man who rings the bell, wouldn't you say? Love hesitated. Ah, yes, sir. Only... Well, Mr. Peggins swears he hasn't been near the tower since Easter. Then perhaps the fingerprints have been waiting patiently for attention? Purbright leaned back in his chair. What else have you discovered? Love consulted his notes. He's a shy sort. Lives with his mother on Rose Lane. Bit of a church mouse, if you take my meaning. But people say he's been acting queer since the flower show. In what way queer? Jumpier than usual. Says he hears the bell ringing at night, though no one else does. Purbright raised an eyebrow. A guilty conscience or an overactive ear? Let's find out which. They visited Rose Lane, where Mrs. Peggins received them in an atmosphere thick with boiled cabbage and maternal suspicion. Harold sat pale and earnest beside the fireplace, his fingers twined like ivy. I didn't touch it, sir, he said at once, eyes darting between them. The bell, I mean. It rings on its own. Everyone knows that. Everyone says that, Purbright corrected gently. But I prefer to confirm what bells can and cannot do before assigning them supernatural agency. Harold swallowed. You don't believe in the curse? Purbright smiled faintly. "I've never known one that couldn't be explained by a ladder and sufficient motivation," Mrs. Peggins bristled. "My Harold wouldn't harm a soul." "He's a churchman." "Indeed," Purbright said. "That must be very comforting." He turned to the son.
"Tell me, Mr. Peggins, where were you when the bell rang?"
"At the tea tent."
"I'd just taken a jam tart from Mrs. Moffat. Ask her. Mrs. Moffat remembers your appetite vividly," Purbright said.
"However, a bell rope doesn't climb itself. Could someone else have had access?" "I keep the tower key in the vestry cupboard, sir."
"Only me and Mr. Cribbins know where." "That is interesting," Purbright murmured. "And do you recall anyone else near that cupboard recently?"
Harold hesitated. "But Mrs. Bly came in last week, said she wanted to see the donation boxes counted properly. She handled the keys a bit." "Ah." Purbright's tone remained polite, but his eyes grew thoughtful. "Did she take anything?" "Not that I saw, sir. But when she left, she said something odd." He frowned, trying to remember. "She said, 'If the bell should ring again, perhaps it will be for me.'" "I thought she was joking," Love scribbled eagerly, while Purbright regarded the young man with a calm that almost concealed interest.
"Thank you, Mr. Peggins. That's very helpful." Back at the station, Love looked pleased. "So it's him then? Nervous, opportunity, fingerprints, the lot?" Purbright folded his hands.
"Constable, I've known many guilty men, and none of them would confess to hearing bells that no one else does. They prefer silence. Our Mr. Peggins is merely frightened." "Then who, sir?" "That," Purbright said, glancing at the clock, "is the question the town will soon answer for us, if we give it enough rope." He smiled slightly at his own phrase and turned to the window, where the church tower rose against the late afternoon sky, quiet now, but holding its secrets with the same smug composure as Flaxborough itself. The following day arrived with the kind of pale sunshine that lent Flaxborough the air of a town pretending to recover from scandal. Shopkeepers opened shutters more briskly than usual, eager to restore normalcy, while conversation continued to coil around Mrs. Bly's death with the steadiness of ivy reclaiming a wall. Inspector Purbright, meanwhile, began his morning with the quiet study of paperwork that was never quite as dull as it appeared. Among the documents from the vicarage, one item refused to settle comfortably into place, a receipt from a firm of stonemasons dated 3 weeks prior, authorizing work on the church's memorial wall. The sum, small but oddly specific, had been paid in cash from the Restoration Fund. It was signed E. Bly in a hand both neat and strangely tentative. Purbright frowned slightly and placed it aside. His reflection was interrupted by the arrival of Constable Love, clutching a grocery ledger. "Bit of a curiosity, sir," he announced. "Mr. Hargreaves from the High Street shop says one of his delivery boys found this in a box of empty jam jars. Thought you'd best see it." Purbright opened the ledger. Between pages devoted to tins of condensed milk and custard powder was an envelope, creased and faintly scented with lavender. The handwriting on the front, "Widow's Legacy Appeal," was the same he had seen in the vicar's safe. Inside lay a folded letter and a small sheet of accounts written in the same disguised script. The letter was short and unsigned. "Transfer the remaining balance quietly. The bell will do the rest. Keep the books clean." Purbright read it twice, his expression remaining politely blank.
"Curious place for theology," he murmured. Love shifted.
"So it's blackmail, sir?"
"Or planning something."
Perhaps both. Or perhaps a game between those who think virtue requires receipts." He rose and placed the envelope under a paperweight shaped like a police whistle.
"Tell me, where exactly was this box of jars found?"
"In the alley behind Hargreaves's, sir. Collection day. Said the box came from the church fair stall. Then it travelled with Mrs. Bly's committee, no doubt."
"Every one of them claims to have handled donations, but none can remember which belonged to whom." Love brightened. "You think someone dropped it by mistake?"
Purbright regarded the envelope. "Mistakes are rarely so conveniently instructive. No, Constable. Someone placed it where it might be found, but not too soon." A breadcrumb with a timetable. Later that afternoon, Purbright visited the church office again. Mr. Cribbins, the treasurer, was there, busily entering figures with the pained diligence of a man doing penance through arithmetic. "Good afternoon," Purbright said pleasantly. "Still keeping the Lord's books in order?" Cribbins looked up, startled.
"Inspector!" "Ah, yes, of course."
Just reconciling the petty cash. The late Mrs. Bligh insisted on thoroughness, so I gather. Did she happen to keep her correspondence here? In her drawer, yes, but it's been cleared since the incident. Purbright moved to the window, watching a pair of pigeons quarrel on the ledge.
"Tell me, Mr. Cribbins, what exactly was the widow's legacy appeal?"
Cribbins hesitated, then cleared his throat. A fund Mrs. Bligh proposed for needy widows in the parish. She was particular about handling it herself. I merely signed off the totals. And the balance? His pen paused.
I'm not sure."
The ledger might show, though some entries are missing. Perhaps the vicar's copies. Perhaps, said Purbright gently. He let the silence linger, long enough for the man's unease to fill it. When he returned to the station, the inspector placed the lavender-scented envelope beside the earlier receipts and sat for a moment in contemplation. 2 pieces of writing, both disguised, both invoking the widow's name, both circling around money meant for the virtuous. An odd morality, he murmured to himself, that prefers its charity neatly laundered. Outside, the church clock struck 5, an ordinary chime, yet it carried the faintest echo of the other bell, the one that had rung when Mrs. Bligh fell. Purbright listened until the last note faded, then reached for his coat. The day, he thought, was beginning to sound like an unfinished confession. The next morning, the churchyard was unusually animated for a weekday. A cluster of choir members lingered near the vestry, whispering in tones that would have disgraced a confession. They fell abruptly silent as Inspector Purbright approached, as though conversation itself were an incriminating act. Mrs. Penlow, the soprano whose voice could curdle milk at 40 paces, greeted him with what she imagined was composure. "Such a dreadful business, Inspector. We can hardly rehearse without thinking of poor Mrs. Bligh. She was always so—"
"Vigilant, indeed," Purbright said mildly.
"I understand she also took a keen interest in the choir's expenses." Mrs. Penlow stiffened, merely in ensuring propriety. She did object to our purchasing hymnals with gilt edges, said it was vanity. "Ah, austerity for the soul," Purbright murmured. "And did the choir find her guidance agreeable?" There was a short, embarrassed laugh from Mr. Tottle, the organist, who spoke as one relieved to be noticed. "She threatened to cancel our Christmas concert unless we wore darker robes. Said crimson was frivolous. How very conscientious of her," Purbright said. "And the concert's proceeds, were they not to go to the widow's legacy appeal?" "They were," Tottle replied, then added awkwardly, "though I don't recall the funds ever being collected. Mrs. Bligh said she'd arrange it personally." Purbright thanked them and stepped back into the sunlight, which was bright but carried little warmth. From the far gate came the slow, deliberate gait of Mr. Penrith, the undertaker, his tall frame emerging between the gravestones like a moral reminder. "Inspector," he said, touching his hat, "I was just coming to see you. We've arranged Mrs. Bligh's service for Friday. Closed coffin, as the vicar requested." "How considerate," said Purbright. "And the vicar? He seemed unusually firm on that point." Penrith hesitated. "Said the lady's family wanted it so, though between us there is no family. Nearest relation's a niece who never visits." "Curious," Purbright murmured. "Then perhaps the vicar is merely sparing the congregation unnecessary distress." "Perhaps," Penrith agreed. "Still a strange business, that bell. I was in the porch when it tolled the second time, Tuesday evening."
"Gave me quite a turn." Purbright looked up sharply. "The second time?"
"Yes, sir. Just one stroke, but clear as a bell ought to be."
"I went straight to the tower door. It was locked fast." The inspector studied him.
"You're quite certain of the time?" "Near 6, I'd say. I just left some wreath forms for the service." Purbright nodded slowly. "Did you notice anyone about?" "No one."
"Only the vicar's lamp in his study." When Penrith had gone, Purbright lingered beside the tower, gazing up into its shadowed louvres.
A second tolling, an echo of the first death, suggested either elaborate superstition or deliberate imitation. And yet, someone had shortened the bell rope by a few inches since his last visit. The frayed end had been freshly knotted, as though to conceal its tampering. Later that day, back at the station, Constable Love reported with the zeal of one bearing revelation. "So the choir's been saying Mrs. Bligh kept a second account book. Hidden it somewhere in the vestry, they think. Perhaps the missing verses of her generosity," Purbright murmured. "Let's see if we can find its melody." By evening, as the church windows glowed faintly with candlelight, Purbright stood once more in the nave, the scent of polish and lilies lingering like deceit. Somewhere above, a rope creaked gently in the still air. He looked up into the dark tower, listening, half expecting that faint metallic sigh that had so unsettled the town. But the bell, for now, kept its counsel, and the silence seemed far less innocent than before. The night drew its breath over Flaxborough like a heavy curtain, the streets muffled beneath a slow drizzle. In the church tower, the shadows gathered thick as coal smoke. Purbright stood with Constable Love at the base of the belfry ladder, their lamps casting narrow cones of light that trembled across the stone. "Are you certain no one's been up here since morning?" Purbright asked. "Only myself, sir." "And the vicar came to lock the vestry," Love replied, his voice low, as though speech might awaken something above them. Purbright nodded, then began the climb. Each rung moaned faintly under his weight, the air growing colder as he neared the bell chamber. The smell of damp rope and old brass filled his nose. When he reached the top, he raised his lamp and froze. The bell rope hung slack, but beside it lay a small scrap of cloth, torn and caught on the pulley. It was grey, like mourning attire, and streaked faintly with something dark. Blood, or perhaps polish, he could not yet tell. Beneath it, the wooden floor bore a faint scuff, the kind made by a boot turning hastily on grit. He called down softly, "Love, fetch the vicar." The constable hesitated, then disappeared into the stairwell. Purbright stayed where he was, listening. For a long while there was nothing but the whisper of the wind through the louvres. Then faintly, so faintly that he thought his senses deceived him, the bell gave a shiver. Not a full toll, but a vibration, as if something unseen had brushed against the great bronze flank. By the time the vicar arrived, pale and flustered, Purbright had descended. The clergyman's eyes darted nervously toward the tower.
"Inspector, must we really at this hour?"
"Only a brief inspection, Mr. Fenning. The undertaker reports hearing a toll at 6 o'clock yesterday evening." The vicar blinked. 6? But the church was empty then. I locked it myself." "Did you indeed?" Purbright's tone was mild, but his gaze was steady. "And yet someone altered the bell rope." "You'd not have done that, of course." The man's lips twitched into an uncertain smile. "No, certainly not. Though I did notice it seemed shorter somehow, but I assumed, well, that the verger had trimmed it." Purbright watched him, the silence lengthening until the vicar's composure began to thin. "You've had a difficult few days," he said at last, almost kindly. "And the late Mrs. Bligh, she involved herself deeply in parish affairs. Did her influence extend to you, perhaps, beyond the usual duties?" The vicar swallowed. "She was persuasive. She kept the accounts, you see. I trusted her judgment." "And the missing church funds?" Purbright asked gently. "Would you trust her judgment there as well?" The vicar's expression faltered.
I don't know what you mean." Purbright gave a small nod, as if accepting that answer for now.
Then, just as he turned to leave, the bell above them moved again, this time a slow, deliberate toll that rolled through the tower like a warning. The vicar gasped, clutching the pew rail. "Stay still," Purbright murmured. The note faded, leaving behind a silence that felt almost alive. Love's voice came faintly from below.
"Sir, no one's up there. The hatch was bolted."
Purbright raised his lamp, the golden light trembling along the walls. "Then something or someone wanted us to believe otherwise," he said quietly. "And it seems they've chosen their hour well." Outside, the rain thickened. and the bell rope swung once more, gently this time, as though the tower itself breathed. Inspector Purbright sat alone in his office, the rain ticking against the window like a patient metronome. The single gas lamp on his desk hissed faintly, throwing a mild halo that softened the edges of the papers spread before him. Among them lay the torn grey cloth from the belfry and a small envelope marked Church Restoration Fund. It was empty. He leaned back, eyes half closed, listening to the faint hum of Flaxborough's night beyond the station walls, the slow tires of a milk van,
a door latch clicking somewhere down the street.
The town, Purbright thought, possessed a genius for pretending its secrets were quaint rather than sordid. A woman could disappear into disgrace here as tidily as a pin dropped into thick carpet. His mind wandered back to Mrs. Bligh, a woman of strong perfume and stronger opinion, fond of leading committees as if they were small armies. Her death, and the curious tolling that followed, had unfastened something subtle in the town's composure. It was as if everyone now spoke in italics, too much emphasis, too little sense. He turned over a report Love had brought in that afternoon. The undertaker, Mr. Creek, swore he'd seen a figure in mourning passing through the churchyard just before the second toll. Creek was a man not easily startled. His livelihood demanded calm before candles and coffins alike. Still, his hand had trembled when signing the statement. Purbright tapped the paper with a finger.
"A figure in mourning," he murmured, almost amused.
"In Flaxborough, that narrows it to half the female population over 50. A knock came at the door. Sergeant Malley entered, hat in hand. "Sir Love's back from checking the vicar's accounts." "There's something odd." Purbright gestured for him to continue. "Seems Mrs. Bligh's handwriting appears on 2 sets of ledgers, the official church books, and another lot found in the vestry drawer. The second set's newer and neater, almost like she meant them to be discovered." Purbright's brows rose slightly. "A conscience at work, or a stage direction for whoever came after her?"
Malley frowned.
"You think she knew that something might happen?" "I think," Purbright said quietly, "that she enjoyed control too much to surrender it all at once. Even the guilty like to write their own epitaphs." The sergeant hesitated, uncertain whether that was meant as jest or warning, then withdrew with a muttered good night. When the door closed, Purbright remained seated, staring at the flicker of gaslight on the window pane. His reflection looked faintly distorted, the glass wobbled by old imperfections. Behind that ghostly image, the darkness of the town stretched outward, calm, familiar, and quietly deceptive. He thought of the bell again, the slow toll, the echo that seemed to linger longer than sound should. Someone had wanted to summon attention but not alarm. It was the gesture of a mind both proud and precise, one that understood drama in miniature. He extinguished the lamp, the office sinking into soft shadow. From somewhere near the church, distant but distinct, came the low moan of wind across the steeple, and beneath it, or perhaps only in imagination, Purbright fancied he heard a single, measured chime. He smiled faintly into the dark. "So you're still playing your tune," he said softly. "Let's see how." The following afternoon arrived pale and damp, with the sort of drizzle that persuaded umbrellas to open out of habit rather than necessity. Inspector Purbright appeared at the church hall precisely at 3, his hat and coat respectfully dull against the bright tartan shawls of the parish ladies gathered for the Restoration Committee meeting. He greeted them with his usual mild courtesy, accepting a cup of tea from Mrs. Vinicum, whose hands shook slightly as she poured.
"A grey day for good works," he observed.
Settling himself near the trestle table where minutes were taken and reputations quietly amended. The vicar was present, paler than usual and attempting a cheerfulness that creaked audibly.
"Inspector, how kind of you to join us," he began.
"A matter of reassurance, I presume?" "Well, partly," Purbright said. "And curiosity, Mr. Fenning. I'm told Mrs. Bligh once kept a most exact ledger of parish donations. Perhaps one of you could tell me who took over that duty after her death. An uneasy shifting passed through the group. Mrs. Vinicum cleared her throat. Well, I suppose I did, in a manner of speaking. Though there was little left to record. Purbright nodded with polite interest.
Indeed, you found the books in order then? Oh, quite, except a few receipts that went missing, but that's hardly... She stopped abruptly, realizing she had said more than was prudent. The inspector smiled faintly.
Receipts? For the bell repairs, perhaps? Her teacup rattled.
Why, yes, how did you...
Just a guess, Purbright murmured. You see, the bell rope was shortened recently. Curiously enough, the missing receipts mention a new length of hemp purchased for the same purpose. Yet the verger insists no such work was done. The vicar blustered.
Surely a trifling mix-up, Inspector. Of course, Purbright agreed, rising.
But trifles have an awkward habit of revealing character, don't they? Especially when money changes hands and silence follows. He turned toward the doorway, pausing only to adjust his hat.
Oh, Mrs. Vinicum, one last thing.
You wore a grey dress at the memorial, did you not? Her face tightened. Yes, everyone did. Quite. Though yours had a torn hem that day.
I noticed it because you knelt to fix a candle and caught it on the brass rail. He smiled pleasantly.
You've mended it beautifully since. For a heartbeat, the hall was still except for the ticking of the wall clock. Then Purbright inclined his head, thanked them for the tea, and departed into the drizzle. Outside, he paused by the churchyard gate, watching his breath mingle with the mist. Behind the curtained windows, he could almost feel the tremor of whispers beginning again, questions, denials, rehearsed indignation. It was exactly as he had hoped. He drew out his notebook, glanced once at the name already written there, Mrs. Vinicum, and, with deliberate neatness, underlined it. By the following morning, Flaxborough's drizzle had cleared, leaving behind a sky of washed pewter and the faint scent of wet stone. Inspector Purbright walked through the market square at an unhurried pace, acknowledging nods from townsfolk who, though courteous, carried expressions of faint expectancy, as if the inspector himself might soon provide the final line to a gossip they had only half composed. He found the vicar already at the church, standing beside a crate marked Flaxborough Foundry, Bell Components. The man greeted him with visible relief.
Inspector?
You'll be glad to know the new bell fittings have arrived. A generous donation from Mrs. Vinicum herself. Quite unexpected. Unexpected generosity is the most suspicious kind, Purbright murmured, running a gloved hand over the crate's lid. Tell me, Mr. Fenning, was this purchase arranged after our meeting yesterday? The vicar blinked.
Indeed, yes.
She came straight here, most apologetic about the confusion with the receipts. Said she wanted to make amends. Purbright smiled mildly. How very conscientious. And she paid in cash, I presume? Yes, I believe so. Quite so. The inspector's eyes lifted to the bell tower. Perhaps we should have a look at her handiwork before the rope is changed again. They climbed the narrow steps, their footsteps echoing softly. The air was dry now, the bell dull and silent in the stillness. At the top, Purbright examined the fittings, neat, freshly polished, and quite new. Yet among the tools left behind was a small tin box, the sort used to store church offerings. He opened it carefully. Inside lay several folded notes and a single coin bearing the faint imprint of dark polish. He held the coin beneath the light.
Curious, he said.
A contribution that never reached the plate. The vicar frowned. Surely that's no more than carelessness. Perhaps, Purbright replied. But carelessness, when repeated, becomes habit, and habit, when profitable, becomes motive. He pocketed the coin, then turned to the bell rope. Notice anything odd, Mr. Fenning? The vicar peered uncertainly. It seems longer than before. Exactly, Purbright said softly. Our benefactress has restored it to its proper length, meaning she or someone close to her shortened it once before. They descended in silence. Outside, the sun broke briefly through the clouds, gilding the wet headstones with reluctant warmth. Purbright paused at the lich gate, his expression unreadable. A woman makes restitution only when she fears discovery, Mr. Fenning. The bell tolled for conscience before it tolled for guilt. The two are rarely far apart. He touched his hat and walked away down the lane, leaving the vicar staring after him, troubled not so much by what had been said as by how calmly it had been spoken. Sunday dawned in Flaxborough with the self-conscious serenity of a town determined to appear respectable again. The church bell, newly refitted, gave a steady, untroubled chime that rippled through the lanes and over the tiled rooftops. The sound seemed to declare that whatever unpleasantness had disturbed the parish had now been properly tidied away. Inspector Purbright stood at the edge of the square, watching the congregation file in. Mrs. Vinicum was among them, pale, composed and clutching a hymnal as if it might steady her hands. She gave him a small, brittle nod as she passed, her eyes lowering quickly afterward. The vicar followed, still pink about the ears, his sermon notes trembling faintly. Purbright waited until the last parishioner had entered before turning toward the undertaker's shop opposite. Mr. Creek appeared at the doorway, polishing his spectacles with nervous diligence. "Quiet morning, sir," he said. "Yes," Purbright replied. Death and devotion rarely compete well for attention. He accepted a folded paper from Creek, a copy of the church ledger the man had been asked to witness the night before. "All in order," the undertaker said. Mrs. Vinicum brought it round herself.
Insisted everything be signed before Sunday's service. Purbright opened the ledger.
Tidy columns, restored balances, and, at the bottom, a final note in Mrs. Vinicum's hand. Benefaction rendered, account closed. He traced the words with a thoughtful finger. "Curious how virtue is always most legible when written after the fact," he murmured. From within the church came the soft swell of the organ. The hymn rose, polite and well-rehearsed. Purbright crossed the street and stood by the churchyard gate, his gaze fixed on the tower. The bell hung motionless now, its tone pure again, though he fancied he could still hear the echo of that earlier toll, the one rung by guilt disguised as piety. When the service ended, Mrs. Vinicum emerged, her composure restored but her eyes oddly distant. Purbright inclined his head. "You've done a fine thing for the parish," he said gently. She gave a strained smile. "We all serve in our way, Inspector." "Indeed," he said, "though not all forms of service leave us quite so weary." Her expression flickered, just for an instant, with something close to relief, or resignation. She moved past him without another word. Purbright watched her go, then turned toward the square where shopkeepers were setting out their window displays and children trailed ribbons through puddles. The town was itself again tidy, gossipy, faintly sanctimonious, and no one seemed inclined to disturb that balance further. At the station later, he placed the small grey scrap of cloth into an envelope marked "Closed Enquiries" and filed it without ceremony. The bell had found its peace, the books their balance, and Mrs. Vinicum her silence. He reached for the next folder on his desk, humming softly as the clock struck noon.